In the heart of a bustling city courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy with the usual mundane cases of traffic violations and petty offenses. The judge sat at his elevated bench, scanning the docket with tired eyes. He had presided over hundreds of such cases before, and nothing ever truly surprised him anymore. But today there was something in the air, an odd sense of anticipation, or perhaps it was just the monotony of his routine dragging him into a false sense of expectation. A woman entered the courtroom and all eyes turned toward her. She was striking her presence undeniable. As she walked confidently toward the defendant's table, her tailored black suit hugged her figure with an air of sophistication that immediately set her apart from the usual crowd of defendants. In jeans and hoodies, her skin was a rich, deep brown framed by a perfectly styled head of hair that cascaded just past her shoulders. She moved with a grace and dignity that seemed almost out of place in a setting like this one, where people often shuffled in and out with little fanfare. The judge barely looked up from his papers as she approached, her gaze steady and unflinching. He barely registered her appearance before quickly flicking through the case details. Her name was familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. From what he saw, it was a routine traffic violation, no insurance or expired registration, just another minor infraction. In a day full of them, he had seen it all before. The woman took her seat without a word, her hands folded neatly in front of her expression unreadable. She didn't fidget or glance around as others often did in such situations. Instead, she sat still with an air of quiet determination, as though this was simply another day, another moment in a life she had long grown accustomed to. The judge raised his gavel briefly and called the case. He glanced down at the papers, once more quickly assessing the situation before giving his ruling. "You're being fined $250 for the violation," he announced flatly. The woman didn't flinch, her eyes still locked on the judge, as though she was observing the proceedings from a distance, almost as if she were above it all. There was no sign of protest, not a single word spoken to challenge the fine. Instead, she simply nodded in acknowledgement, accepting the punishment with a grace that seemed to make the judge uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite place. He moved on, quickly dismissing the case without much thought. He was accustomed to people accepting their fines with little resistance. He didn't think twice about it. After all, in his eyes, she was just another face in the crowd, no different than the many others who had passed through his courtroom doors over the years. The woman stood slowly and walked out of the courtroom with the same calm demeanor she had entered with. Her steps were measured and deliberate, as though she had places to be and things to do. She didn't look back or make a sound as she left, leaving the courtroom almost as silently as she had arrived. The judge watched her go for a brief moment, still not fully registering who she was or why something about the encounter felt off, but he quickly dismissed the feeling as just another passing thought and turned his attention to the next case, unaware that he had just crossed paths with someone far more important than he had ever imagined. The woman walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking steadily against the cold marble floors of the courthouse. Her eyes remained fixed ahead as she navigated the hallways with precision. She had dealt with moments like this many times before, people assuming things about her before even hearing a word from her. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, nor would it be the last. Her mind drifted back to the earlier part of the day when she had been in the office reviewing case files for an upcoming trial. She had spent hours combing through legal briefs, preparing arguments that would put away dangerous criminals for good. As a federal prosecutor, she had seen the worst of the criminal world and fought tirelessly to bring justice to victims who had no voice. But today she was here in this courtroom for a minor traffic violation, a brief interruption in her otherwise demanding schedule. She never expected that the day would unfold this way. For a brief moment, as she stood at the courthouse exit, she allowed herself to breathe deeply, letting the cool air fill her lungs. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. It wasn't the judge's mistake either. It was something deeper, something she had become all too familiar with over the years. As she moved through spaces where her presence was often questioned and doubted just because of who she was. She thought back to her early years in law school when she had been one of the few black women in a sea of predominantly white faces. Every day had felt like a battle to prove she belonged. There were whispers behind her back and comments that made her question if she was even cut out for the law, but she had pressed on, determined Not to let anyone define her, she pushed herself harder than anyone else, studied longer, worked later, because deep down she knew that if she didn't prove herself, every single day the world would see her as less than. That mindset had followed her and into her career as well. The cases she handled were often high profile and dangerous, but the more complex the case, the more she felt at home. She wasn't just another assistant district attorney or local lawyer. She was someone with a purpose, someone who had earned her place in the courtroom and in the hearts of those who sought justice. She wasn't just representing the government, she was representing those who couldn't represent themselves. But despite her position and experience, it was moments like today that reminded her that some people would never see her as anything more than a black woman in a suit, a woman who didn't belong in their space, a woman they could dismiss without a second thought. The walk to her car was short, but it gave her enough time to reflect. She let her mind wander to the judge for a brief moment, the man who would find her without a second glance. Who was he really? Did he understand the weight of his actions? Did he realize how much he had just unknowingly revealed about himself? It wasn't that the fine mattered. It wasn't even about the money or the violation. It was the presumption, the arrogance that she was just another ordinary person, passing through a system that had long been stacked against people like her. As she slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of something. Anger. Yes. But more than that, a quiet resolve. She had been underestimated countless times, and each time she had risen above it. It didn't matter if the world saw her as something less than she was. She knew who she was, and she knew what she was capable of. And today was just another reminder that the fight wasn't over. Later that afternoon, as the judge sifted through his pile of paperwork, his mind kept drifting back to the woman in the courtroom. Something about her stayed with him, lingering like an echo he couldn't shake. Her composed demeanor, the way she carried herself, it was almost as if she knew something he didn't, as if she was above the petty interactions of the courtroom. But he quickly dismissed the thought. She was just another defendant after all. He had seen so many people come and go, it was hard to remember any of them, let alone recognize them as anything more than a name on a list. He continued his review of the case files, his eyes moving from page to page, until he came across a name that made him pause. The same woman. The name was unmistakable, and as he stared at it, something clicked in his mind, a sudden realization that left him frozen. He looked at the case details once more, his heart racing. The woman he had found was not just any ordinary defendant. She was the assistant U.S. attorney handling one of the most significant federal investigations in the country. A woman who held a position of power and influence, someone who had earned respect from her colleagues in the legal system. The judge felt his stomach drop. He blinked, disbelieving, his mind still processing what he was seeing. This wasn't just any woman. This was a federal prosecutor, someone whose career had made waves in high-profile cases. He had found her without hesitation, without even realizing who she was. The absurdity of it hit him like a ton of bricks. How could he have been so careless, so dismissive? His hands shook slightly as he flipped through the case file, hoping to find something that would absolve him of his mistake. But there was nothing. The evidence was undeniable. The woman had been standing before him in the courtroom just hours earlier, and he had given her a fine like it was a mere formality. It had been a routine decision for him, but for her, it was far from ordinary. She wasn't just any defendant. She was a powerful force in the legal system, a woman who had spent years fighting for justice in ways he could barely comprehend. And he had treated her as if she were just another person to be dismissed. The judge rubbed his temples, trying to calm the growing anxiety that threatened to overwhelm him. He felt like a fool. He had misjudged her completely, and now the weight of that mistake pressed heavily on his conscience. He had no way of knowing if she had recognized his ignorance, if she had been aware of the casual disrespect he had shown her. But he couldn't shake the thought that she had walked out of that courtroom, perhaps even laughing to herself at how easily he had underestimated her. As the evening wore on, the judge found himself lost in a spiral of self-doubt. He had seen the woman's name many times before in the headlines, but it had never fully registered. Now that he knew who she was, he could see her everywhere, in the news, in high-profile cases, in the minds of the public. The realization that he had wronged her hit him hard. He had thought himself above making such careless mistakes, but now it seemed clear that his own biases had clouded his judgment. He had always prided himself on being fair, impartial, and objective. But today, he had failed to live up to those ideals, and it made him sick to his stomach. The judge sat in his office late into the night, his thoughts swirling. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's calm demeanor as she accepted the fine and the realization that she was a federal prosecutor, the very kind of person he was supposed to be supporting, not dismissing. His mind raced as he replayed the moment over and over. Why hadn't he recognized her? Why hadn't he taken a moment to really see her? He knew what he had to do. There was no way he could simply let this go. He had made a grievous error, and it wasn't just about the fine. It was about the assumptions he had made, the way he had dismissed her based on nothing more than her appearance. It was a mistake that could cost him his reputation, and he couldn't allow that to happen. The judge knew he had to offer an apology, but he didn't want to make matters worse by appearing insincere. He decided the best course of action was to reach out through official channels first, a letter, perhaps, one that would allow him to express his regret without causing a scene. He drafted it carefully, his pen moving slowly as he chose each word. He didn't want to sound like he was groveling, but he also didn't want to understate how deeply sorry he was for his actions. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and read the letter again. It felt right. Not perfect, but genuine. With a deep sigh, he picked up the phone and instructed his clerk to send the letter to the woman's office, hoping she would read it and understand that it was heartfelt. He didn't know what kind of response, if any, he would get. She was a powerful person, a woman who had earned respect through years of hard work. Would she even take the time to acknowledge his apology? Or would she simply brush it off as one more meaningless gesture? The days that followed felt long and uncertain. The judge kept an eye on the news, waiting for any signs that the woman had responded publicly or privately. He was aware of the media frenzy surrounding the incident. Headlines like, "Judge finds federal prosecutor ignorant of her identity," were everywhere. It was embarrassing, to say the least. He knew that the public was looking at him through a very different lens now, and every word he spoke felt scrutinized. But days passed, and there was no word from her. No press conferences, no statements. The silence was deafening, and it gnawed at the judge's conscience. Was she angry? Was she planning some kind of public retaliation? He had no way of knowing, and that uncertainty kept him on edge. It wasn't until a week later that he received a phone call. It was her office. He picked up the phone with trembling hands, unsure of what to expect. A calm voice on the other end introduced herself as the woman's assistant and informed him that the apology had been received. The judge exhaled in relief, but the assistant wasn't finished. "She appreciates the gesture," the assistant said, "but she has decided not to comment publicly. She doesn't believe in making spectacles out of mistakes, especially those that can be corrected quietly." The judge's heart sank. Was that it? Was she so indifferent to his apology that she didn't even want to meet him face to face? The silence on the other end felt like a quiet rejection. But before he could say anything more, the assistant continued. "She does, however, request a private meeting with you to discuss the matter further." The judge's breath caught. A meeting. That was something. He had no idea what the woman's intentions were, but he was grateful for the opportunity to make things right in a more personal way. The thought of speaking with her, of hearing her perspective face to face, felt both daunting and redemptive. He was about to learn, he hoped, what it truly meant to face his own biases and mistakes. The woman was granting him a chance to redeem himself, and he wasn't about to squander it. The judge spent the next few days in a state of restless anticipation. He couldn't stop replaying the conversation with the assistant over and over in his head. A private meeting. The opportunity to face the woman he had wronged, to truly listen to her, and hopefully begin to make amends. He had no idea what the conversation would hold, but he knew it would be crucial. His reputation, his integrity, and his future as a judge hung in the balance. He arrived early at the location she had suggested, a small but well-maintained coffee shop just a few blocks from the courthouse. The place had an air of quiet professionalism, with muted tones and soft lighting, a stark contrast to the usual chaos of his courtroom. He wanted to give this meeting the respect it deserved, but his nerves were on edge. This was no longer a simple matter of courtroom procedure. This was a moment of reckoning. When the woman arrived, he recognized her immediately, though this time, there was no courtroom formality to shield her presence. She was dressed casually in a black leather jacket and jeans, yet still exuded an aura of authority that made heads turn as she walked in. Her gaze was steady, calm, her confidence, even in this informal setting, unmistakable. She didn't look angry, but there was a quiet intensity in her eyes, as though she were sizing him up even before the conversation began. She took a seat across from him, offering a polite but brief smile. They exchanged a few pleasantries, but the small talk was quickly over. She didn't waste time on niceties, and the judge respected that. "I received your letter," she began, her voice calm but firm. "And I appreciate the apology, but I won't pretend that it doesn't carry weight. It's not just about the fine. It's about how easily you assumed I was just another person to dismiss." The judge swallowed, his throat dry. Her words were measured, but they cut through him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He had been expecting anger, perhaps even confrontation, but what she said instead was far more powerful. She wasn't just addressing his mistake in the courtroom. She was addressing the deeper assumptions, the systemic biases that had led him to treat her as less than she was. He had treated her with indifference because of who she appeared to be, not because of who she truly was. "I know you probably didn't mean any harm," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "But the truth is, your actions reflect a larger problem, one that people like me face all the time. We're judged by our skin, by our gender, before anyone bothers to know our capabilities. I've spent years fighting against that, but it's exhausting. To be constantly underestimated, constantly having to prove yourself." The judge nodded, guilt rising in his chest. He knew this was true. He had been a part of that system, albeit unintentionally. He had fallen victim to his own biases, as so many in his position had. But hearing it from her, hearing the personal toll it took on someone so accomplished, was something he had never truly understood until now. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling hollow but sincere. "I didn't mean to make you feel like that. It was wrong of me to judge you so quickly." She met his apology with silence for a moment, as if weighing whether or not it was enough. Then she spoke again, this time more softly, though no less direct. "Apologies are a start, but actions speak louder than words. You have the power to make change in your courtroom. You can make sure that others aren't treated the way I was today, but only if you acknowledge that these biases exist and actively work to confront them." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and the judge couldn't help but feel the weight of them. He had spent his career believing that he was impartial, above the petty prejudices that so many others harbored. But in that moment, he saw the truth. His actions had been shaped by those very biases, and he needed to take responsibility for that. "I want to do better," he said quietly. "I don't want to be part of the problem anymore. I'll do whatever it takes to learn, to change." The woman studied him for a long moment before nodding, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke again, her tone less hard but still firm. "Actions speak louder than words. Start by looking at your own behavior and at the system you're a part of. It's going to be uncomfortable, but you have to be willing to face it. Only then will you truly understand how deep this goes." With that, the conversation ended. The judge left the coffee shop with a new understanding, a recognition of how far he had yet to go in confronting his own prejudices. The woman, for her part, had granted him a rare gift, the opportunity to change, to grow, to become the kind of judge who could truly serve justice. The weeks following the meeting with the woman were a whirlwind for the judge. Her words lingered in his mind, replaying over and over in the quiet moments of his day. "Actions speak louder than words," she had told him. It was a simple phrase, yet it resonated deeply with him. He could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth that he had been complicit in a system that allowed biases to influence decisions, even those made by someone as self-assured as him. He had spent the following days reviewing case after case, not just the ones on his docket, but those from the past. He found himself questioning every decision he had ever made, trying to see them through a different lens. How many times had he subconsciously allowed racial or gender assumptions to shape his judgments? How many people, like the woman who had stood before him, had suffered because of his failure to recognize the systemic biases at play? The more he examined his past rulings, the more he realized that change wasn't just necessary, it was urgent. He had spent years priding himself on being fair and impartial, but the reality was that fairness was more than just a claim. It was something that had to be actively cultivated, and it wasn't enough to acknowledge his shortcomings. He had to confront them head on and take responsibility for the impact they had. He began to attend workshops and seminars on implicit bias and systemic racism, something he had never considered necessary before. At first, he was defensive. The discomfort he felt during those first few sessions was overwhelming. He didn't want to believe that he, someone who had dedicated his life to the law, had been unknowingly perpetuating harmful systems. But the more he listened, the more he realized that he couldn't simply excuse himself because he had good intentions. Good intentions weren't enough when lives were on the line. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, the judge began to make subtle but deliberate changes in his behavior. He started paying closer attention to the defendants who came before him, noticing the subtle biases he had previously overlooked. He began to ask himself, was the defendant's race or background influencing how they were being treated? Were their actions being perceived through a lens of prejudice? He became more attuned to the words he used in his rulings, ensuring that his language was measured and free of assumptions. However, the judge's newfound awareness didn't go unnoticed. Colleagues and attorneys began to observe his changes. Some praised him for his efforts, noting that he seemed more thoughtful in his decisions. Others, however, were skeptical. There were murmurs in the legal community about whether the judge had truly changed or was simply going through the motions to save face. One afternoon, several months after the meeting, the woman, the federal prosecutor, walked into his courtroom once again. The judge had been bracing himself for this moment, unsure of what to expect. Would she see the changes he had made? Would she believe that he had learned from his mistake? Or would she view him as just another man trying to appease his guilt? This time, when the judge called her case, he didn't make the same assumptions. He didn't rush to judgment. Instead, he observed her with the same respect and attention that he would have for any other attorney in his courtroom. As the proceedings unfolded, the woman's presence in the courtroom seemed almost effortless, her arguments sharp and poised. She didn't need to assert dominance. She simply let her expertise speak for itself. After the case was concluded, the judge caught her eye for a brief moment, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything then, but as she left the courtroom, she nodded slightly, acknowledging him in a way that suggested she had been watching him as carefully as he had been watching her. She hadn't forgotten their meeting, nor had she dismissed him. And that was enough for the judge. In that moment, he knew he still had much work to do, but he also knew that he had taken the first steps toward becoming the man he had always believed himself to be, a man capable of truly seeing others, not just as they appeared, but for who they were. And that, he realized, was the essence of justice. Months passed, and the judge continued his journey of self-reflection and change. His actions in the courtroom had become more deliberate, more conscious. He made it a point to listen more attentively, to ask questions that went beyond the surface. He no longer let his initial impressions guide his decisions. Instead, he took the time to engage with each case and each person who stood before him, ensuring that his rulings were based on the facts rather than assumptions. But the real shift, the one he hadn't fully anticipated, was in the way his colleagues and peers began to respond to him. Conversations in the courthouse had shifted. There were whispers about the judge's transformation, some skeptical, some genuinely impressed. He could sense the curiosity in the eyes of his fellow judges, some of whom had always considered him a staunch traditionalist, resistant to change. But now they were watching him more closely, perhaps even wondering if his changes were something they could learn from as well. One afternoon, a fellow judge, who had long been a mentor to him, approached him in the hallway. The man, older and grizzled by years of experience in the legal system, eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You've been different lately," the mentor remarked, his voice tinged with the weight of unspoken questions. "What's going on?" You've always been the one who believed in the system, in its fairness. Now you're questioning everything. You've been talking about implicit bias and systemic injustice. Are you really ready to make those changes, or are you just trying to placate a few people? The judge paused, his thoughts momentarily shifting back to the woman, to their conversation in the coffee shop. He realized that the questions the mentor asked were exactly the ones he had struggled with in the beginning: doubts, fears, and insecurities about whether his efforts were enough or if they were just superficial. But he had come to understand that real change didn't happen overnight. It wasn't about giving the appearance of change. It was about committing to it, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. "I'm not placating anyone," the judge said, his voice steady. "I've learned that fairness isn't just about following the rules. It's about recognizing where the system has failed and making sure I don't contribute to that failure. I've been complicit in it for too long." The mentor studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It's not easy," he said, his voice softening. "And I'm not sure how long you'll last in this system with these ideals, but I respect that you're willing to try." The judge felt a surge of relief. It wasn't an outright endorsement, but it was enough, a recognition that what he was trying to do wasn't without merit. He had begun to realize that the journey toward real change wasn't about achieving immediate validation from others. It was about the inner conviction to do what was right, even when it was difficult or unpopular. That evening, he sat at his desk, reflecting on the progress he had made. The road ahead was still uncertain, and he knew there would be more challenges to face, more moments of doubt, more cases where his biases might resurface without warning. But he also knew that he had come too far to turn back. He had made a promise to himself and to those who would appear before him in his courtroom. He would not let them be judged based on anything other than the truth. And then, as if to solidify his resolve, he glanced at a small plaque on his desk, an old memento from his early days on the bench. It read, "Justice is blind." For the first time, he understood what that really meant. Justice wasn't about ignoring the differences in people, but about seeing them for who they truly were. That, he realized, was the essence of fairness, and it was something he would continue to strive for every day. The following week, as he entered the courtroom, he was met by a familiar face, the federal prosecutor. This time, their interaction was brief, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. No words needed to be said. He had already made his commitment, and she had seen that change. There was nothing left to prove. It was, after all, about action, not just words. The judge's transformation didn't happen overnight, but in time, it became clear that he was no longer the same man who had handed down that careless fine months ago. He became known for his thoughtful, measured approach, and his courtroom demeanor had earned the respect of not only his peers, but also the community he served. Slowly, others began to notice the subtle shifts in the way he ruled on cases. His judgments no longer reflected the biases and assumptions that had once influenced his decisions, and that was the change he had long hoped for. One afternoon, months after the incident with the federal prosecutor, the judge sat at his desk preparing for another day in court. The courthouse buzzed with the usual chatter of lawyers, clerks, and defendants, but today something felt different. There was a quiet weight in the air, a sense of anticipation. He'd heard whispers that the woman, the federal prosecutor he had wronged, was scheduled to present a case in his courtroom once again. Despite all the progress he had made, there was still a part of him that felt a little apprehensive. It wasn't just about the case, it was about her, about how she would view him now. Would she see the changes he had made? Would she believe that his actions had truly reflected the lessons he had learned? The doors to the courtroom swung open, and the woman entered, once again exuding that quiet confidence, the same sharp focus she had carried with her the first time they met. But there was a difference this time. She wasn't just a defendant. She wasn't someone to be judged. She was the person responsible for holding those who broke the law accountable. And in that moment, the judge realized just how far he had come. As the case began, he watched her with a sense of admiration. Her arguments were well-structured, her logic impeccable. She was the professional he had underestimated, the one he had dismissed. And now here she was, standing before him with a poise that matched her credentials, her professionalism. The judge had learned that day, more than any courtroom ruling could teach him, that true justice was about recognizing the full humanity of the people before him, no matter their race, their background, or their status. The trial proceeded smoothly, and the judge found himself more and more impressed by the prosecutor's approach. As he rendered his ruling, he ensured that every word reflected the impartiality and fairness he had promised himself. He spoke with clarity, his tone measured, making sure to emphasize the importance of due process. In that moment, he wasn't just passing judgment on a case. He was passing judgment on his own evolution, on his commitment to fairness and justice. After the case was concluded, the woman paused at the door, her eyes briefly meeting his. There was a subtle nod, one that felt almost like an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared journey. In that brief moment, the judge realized that his efforts had not gone unnoticed. The changes he had made, the growth he had undergone, had not been for nothing. Later, as the courtroom emptied, he stood at his desk, reflecting on the path he had walked since the day he had found her. The lesson he had learned had been hard, but it had been necessary. He had come to understand that justice wasn't just about the law, it was about the people who stood before him and ensuring that they were treated with dignity and respect. His thoughts turned to the future. He knew there was still much work to be done. The fight against systemic bias and injustice was ongoing, and he couldn't rest on his laurels. But in that moment, as the last few cases for the day were settled, the judge felt a sense of peace. He had made amends. He had earned a second chance, and he would continue striving to be the kind of judge who would always see the people before him as they truly were, not as stereotypes or assumptions, but as human beings with stories, with dignity, with rights. And in that realization, he knew he had finally found what justice truly meant.